Pushpesh Kumar has agreed to do the talk for us. So thanks, Pushpesh, also for being here and everyone for coming. Anukriti will now do the introduction. Thanks.
Thank you.
Welcome and good evening. I would like to introduce today's speaker. Dr. Pushpesh Kumar teaches sociology at the University of Hyderabad. He has edited the book Sexuality, Abjection, and Queer Existence in Contemporary India from Routledge and serves on the International Advisory Board of the Community Development Journal, published by Oxford University Press, UK and Ireland. He was a British Academy Visiting Fellow in the Department of Anthropology, London School of Economics and Political Science in 2009. He received M.N. Srinivas Memorial Prize for Young Sociologist from the Indian Sociological Society in 2007. As a pro-feminist thinker, he wrote in the Economic and Political Weekly's special volume on men and feminism in India in 2015. In 2017, he was invited by the South Asia Center, Syracuse University, to share his research on queering Indian sociology. His areas of interest include gender, sexuality, globalization and social changes, caste and kinship, and pedagogical practices in sociology and social sciences. Kumar, over to you.
Should I start now?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. So thank you very much for having me for this talk. And this talk is about the transgender movement, which is going on in India and has been intensified since 2014. So in this paper, I discuss the transgender communities' fight for justice and developmental rights since 2014 and response of the Indian government towards this assertion. And the point of choosing 2014 is not because the fight for the justice begins in this year, but for the reason that India witnessed an intensification and public visibility of transgender mobilization following the recognition of transgender communities as legal citizens through the landmark Supreme Court verdict called NALSA Judgment. So even before that, the trans communities, mainly the trans feminine identities like hijras and kothis, have been front runners of larger mobilization of the LGBT communities since late 1980s and early 1990s, which has mostly cohered around the reading down of Section 377 of the Indian Penal Code, instituted by colonial government, as we all know, in 1861 and continued till August 2018. The other context of transmobilization is HIV/AIDS pandemic during 1990s. In these two contexts, the transgender communities to a certain extent internalize the language of right, sexual rights and identity-based rights. These two contexts, however, were rather narrow and limited in scope, in contrast to Supreme Court NALSA verdict, which offers and makes it incumbent upon the state to ensure substantive right to the communities. So, besides formally recognizing the transgender person as citizens, the verdict extended substantive rights on the grounds of multiple and intersectional marginalities of the community. And what leads to the mobilization of transgender communities across India post 2014 is the inability and unresponsiveness of the neoliberal state in translating the substantive provisions of the NALSA judgment into policy and practice. In this, the government has not only ignored the transformatory and empowering provisions laid out in the Supreme Court verdict of 2014, but has shown apathy and indifference to the major concerns sometimes raised by the community. And it is against this backdrop that the continuing struggle of the transgender subjects could be understood and contextualized. Recently, however, the Indian government has responded to the fierce criticism and mobilizations of the community by considering certain demands through Transgender Person Protection of Rights Rules 2020, which definitely shows some success of the trans community mobilization. We should not congratulate the state, but we have to congratulate the community because of their mobilization have borne some fruit. Yet some other critical issues are left outside and unaddressed in the rules, and the movement for developmental concerns and community justice continues. This mobilizational and protest involved profound engagement of the transgender communities, civil society groups, and a few academics who are part of community or friends and allies of queer and transgender groups. There are instances when some of the transgender intellectuals and leaders have left their privileged corporate and NGO employment and have become full time activists in their fight against statist injustices. This has given public visibility and brought prestige to the transgender activist, but the trans studies scholar and activists in the West have pointed out that visibility does not ensure entitlements and justice. In the US, for example, trans women of color activists get invited to give talks at fancy private colleges and non-profits, but cannot find permanent jobs to pay rent. Transgender YouTube stars can engage in commodity activism by appearing in videos sponsored by major skincare brands, but remain financially dependent on haphazard contributions to crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter and Patreon. So, what is required is improved material condition through robust welfare interventions and affirmative actions of the state. In India, the transgender community is asking for such intervention from the government promised in the NALSA verdict of the apex court. Some of the civil society groups engaged in community mobilization and protest and developing a radical and nuanced critique of various drafts of transgender bills introduced by the government of India include Sampurna, an online trans and intersex collective in India, Lawyers Collective, which is an initiative to empower marginal groups through law and advocacy and intervention, and Tata Institute of Social Sciences Queer Collective, a student organization. Though these organizations have been nodal in pointing the fallacies of government's draft bills and acts and contributed in shaping the agenda of community mobilization, in my understanding, every single member of transgender community participating in these collective mobilization constitute an important voice against the injustice and discrimination of the state. Now, despite intensification of transgender protests post NALSA and growing media coverage and visibility, there is hardly any academic writing reflecting on this significant community mobilization. A few writings from legal scholars, however, engage with critical textual reading of NALSA verdict. And what they do, they mostly take a Foucauldian perspective in highlighting how juridical discourse, in this case, the text of NALSA judgment, while delivering justice to the transgender subjects and acknowledging diversity of embodiments, nonetheless engenders a very restricted and hegemonic understanding of transgender subjects, producing them as third gender beyond the fundamental natural binary of male and female. This not only results in othering, but a symbolic subordination of third gender to the paramount naturalized binary of male and female, reinforcing heterosexism and transphobia. Anirudh Datta and Raina Roy claim that NGOs, funding agencies, HIV/AIDS, as well as Supreme Court of India clearly distinguish transgender from cisgender. Such attempts universalize and colonize the identities by erasing diversities and multiple discourses and practices spanning multiple regions of South Asia. Reflecting on the NALSA verdict and othering of transgender community, Jeffrey Redding surmised that the text of verdict incorporates a paradigmatic understanding of transgenderism. It iterates the idea that only reproductively uncapacious men or women choose a gender different from binary. The reproductively capacious ones need not bother to choose their gender. They are naturally placed in appropriate genders, which precedes their arrival in the social world. The gender practices are much more complex, and many members of transgender communities could participate in reproduction and exist with a cis-normative embodiment. Based on James Scott, Redding argued that states' measuring and demarcation exercises involve a peculiar way of seeing the powerless, people in which some kind of people are created more abjectly than others. So the legal text of Supreme Court verdict not only created a category but also hierarchized those reproductively capricious and uncapricious while erasing complex and overlapping practices of trans and cis people. So what they do, but there is no systematic, documentation or anything of transgender movement in India. Even if you try to Google it, you'll get many magazine articles, but not in academic writing as such, except these critiques of the text from a Foucauldian kind of perspective. So what I do here is considering the neoliberal governance of India. What is my theoretical and methodological framework here? Is I wish to understand its reluctance, the government's reluctance in extending substantive socio-economic entitlements to transgender communities with the concept of Paul O'Connell, who talks about death of socio-economic rights under neoliberal state, implying a de facto harmonization of constitutional protection of rights with privatization and drastic cut on wealth. So these are the contradictions. So what a neoliberal state is doing, it will offer you civil rights, constitutional protection of rights with privatization, and so how it will address, the substantive rights, or it will extend you the rights, but it will not make the resources available to address and implement something very substantively. So the harmonization of constitutional protection of rights with privatization and drastic cut on welfare funds, and that there lies the contradiction. The reduced budget on social sector spending makes it difficult for the government to consider anything which ensures socio-economic entitlements. The demands of transgender community, such as free sex reassignment surgery, trans-friendly healthcare, gender-neutral washrooms in public places, trans-friendly prison, pension, etc., would require concrete budgetary allocation and provision of official and bureaucratic channels to implement them. In times of intensifying privatization and constant reduction on welfare funding in India, the non commitment to substantive justice can be perspectivized. What also informs my understanding are writings of many trans scholars who suggest that recognition or read legal recognition does not necessarily translate into justice and empowerment for marginalized groups and communities. In documenting transgender mobilization and state response, I have substantively relied on secondary sources here, newspaper articles, reflections in magazine, web joins, and also some of the interviews with some trans intellectuals from Hyderabad city. Am I audible?
Yeah, Pushpesh, you're
Yes.
audible.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah, all good.
Okay.
Yeah, okay, thanks.
So what is substantive justice? What do we mean here? So by substantive provisions, I mean those state policy provisions which address the historical injustices and institutionalized violence and deprivation, ensuring concrete socio-economic entitlements to eliminate structural inequalities and dehumanization. So whatever is historically instituted injustices and violence and deprivation that have to addressed with concrete socio-economic entitlements to eliminate structural inequalities and dehumanization. These are adequately addressed in Supreme Court verdict despite its othering and transphobia highlighted by academic critics, as I have already pointed out. By mobilization, I meant not only the collective protest in the streets, but constant critical reflection on the government's attempt to dilute and weaken the contents of substantive underpinnings of NALSA verdicts while translating that into the laws. It was only in 1990 that transgender communities, particularly Hijra and Kotis, entered public discourse for being considered as high-risk groups within HIV/AIDS context. Transgender became an umbrella term later that came to represent many forms and subcultures of gender non-conformity, encompassing all subjects who are not stereotypically masculine or feminine or cisgender. In its contemporary deployment, and at the risk of creating a new binary between cis and transgender subjects, this category is ever expanding one, its boundaries porous enough to include myriad demonstrations of atypical masculinities and femininities. So in the Supreme Court NALSA verdict, transgender is generally described as an umbrella term for person whose gender identity, gender expression, or behavior does not conform to their biological sex. This expansive definition provided a ground for different gender non-conforming genders to assert and articulate their identity. Claims were made by inclusion by trans masculine persons and communities using the open endedness of gender nonconformity in the spirit of the judgment. The Delhi High Court on 22nd September 2015 provided protection to CV, a self identified trans man, against the combined violence of family and police. Shows the significance of NALSA verdict for different constituencies within transgender identity. It further led to assertion of intersex communities to be identified as a separate entity and not conflated with other transgender identities, but that is not officially recognized. The other traditional trans-feminine cultural and religious identities are Jogtas, Shivshaktis, Mangalmukhi, apart from Hijras, Kothis, are given due acknowledgement and inclusion within community assertion and mobilization. The struggle for recognition of different constituencies within transgender is also reflected in Transgender Act 2019, which identifies trans men, trans women, intersex, genderqueer, cultural identities like Kinnar, Hijra, Aravani, Jogta as different groups constituting broader identity of transgender. The community has also asserted transsexuals as separate identity with their own specific claims and assertion. Transgender collectives have gone online in recent years with trans women, trans men, intersex, non-binary, genderqueer, and many others who might assert and mobilize. Some of them have formed online groups where they debate issues of common and specific concerns. Now, what are the key provisions and substantive elements embodied within the NALSA verdict of 2014, which runs into 103 pages? But I sort of try to summarize it in certain ways so that I will not take more time. So, underscoring the right to personal autonomy and self-determination under art. So, the most important thing is that right to personal autonomy, revolutionizing and democratizing the concept of gender. So, self-determination under Article 21 of Indian Constitution, the court observed that gender to which a person belongs is to be determined by the person concerned. The verdict states that gender identity refers to each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with sex assigned at birth, including the personal sense of body, which may involve a freely chosen modifications of bodily appearance or functions by medical, surgical, or other means, or other expression of gender, including dress, speech, and mannerisms. The court emphatically noted that dignity cannot be realized if a person is forced to grow up and live in a gender which they do not identify or relate to. The verdict also implied that a person's sense of gender would match their official identity without any certificate from a doctor or proof of having undergone sex reassignment surgery, as the court clarified that any insisted on sex reassignment surgery is immoral and illegal. So this is a very substantive, verdict in the sense part of the verdict, in the sense that self-determination of gender, which can be very creatively and imaginatively, uh, you know, uh, mm, uh, imaginatively used and appropriated by the transgender community, and they are definitely doing it. Um, the second thing which I find very substantive about the judgment is recognition of intersecting inequalities and ensuring state's responsibility. So the judgment makes state as responsibility, the responsibilization of state, which also happened after that 2012 rape incident, that feminists tried to responsibilize the state, but the state was trying to escape that responsibilization in a substantive way. So here the Supreme Court judgment has also tried to, the Justice Verma committee I was talking about. So here the state has also tried to responsibilize the state. So recognizing the entrapment of intersecting inequalities of majority sexual and non-gender conforming persons, the Supreme Court's verdict mentions in all their responses for discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity, take account of the manner in which such discrimination may intersect with other forms of discrimination. It holds the state responsible for ensuring gender non-conforming persons access to medical care and counseling, addressing particular needs of persons based on sexual orientation, gender identity. The healthcare should also include reproductive health and access to HIV/AIDS information and therapy, and access to hormonal and other therapy, as well as gender reassignment where desired. Besides, the prison and detention system and other public spaces should be made trans friendly. Transgender women may be able to seek protection under specific laws for women. The court issued a series of directions to central and state governments, including granting legal recognition to persons' self-identified gender, treating transgender persons as socially, educationally backward classes, and extending reservation in public education and employment, providing separate HIV serosurveillance for transgender persons and appropriate health policies, among others. The NALSA verdict also holds the state responsible in instituting healthcare system which is competent and sensitive in providing healthcare services to hijras and TZs, and stigma and discrimination reducing measures at various settings. It makes a mention of intersex person and outlines specific discrimination and exclusion from families, subjecting intersex children's bodies to heterosexist medical establishment, assigning the gender identity in alignment with dominant gender norms, or dispensing with the intersex fetus through medical technology. Given the progressive and substantive justice approach of the apex court, the Indian government's response in translating the legal text into law appear ironical and even contradictory in many instances. What followed was a series of community resistance in response to government attempt to introduce different bills, finally culminating in Transgender Protection of Rights Act 2019. As a prelude to the discussion that follows, I submit that there has been a continual resistance of communities since 2014 towards the various versions of transgender bill introduced by the Indian government. The Transgender Person Protection of Rights Act 2019 is also held problematic on many counts. While the government has recently come up with the rules, the protection of right rules by accommodating some demands of transgender communities, the communities still feel betrayed as all provisions of NALSA verdict are not included in the rules. Those members from the transgender communities who belong to marginal caste background find the rules inadequate in accommodating caste-based discrimination within and outside community. Dalit transgender persons are pressing their demand for horizontal reservation by filing cases in the high courts. So, what has been the government's response? Highlighting the government's reaction on NALSA verdict in 2014, an article in Indian Express entitled Government's Objects SC Empowering the Third Gender, while another one in Hindu Daily wrote, hardly 5 months after the Supreme Court judgment, the central government raised several objections against the verdict. The ministry asked the court if it expected the government suo motu to include all transgender in other backward classes, so that is a problem. There was an established procedure under the National Commission for Backward Classes Act 1993 for this. Though the clarification sought by Government of India was less alarming than the above article suggested, the community was concerned over the two issues raised in government clarification to the Supreme Court. Firstly, the application from the government mentioned that 6 months stipulated in NALSA judgment is not enough to implement all chapters mandated by Supreme Court, and hence the recommendation will be rolled out in phased manner. In the understanding of the community, this might lead to indefinite delays and backtracking of NALSA judgment, and that's what has happened. Secondly, the applicants point that the categorization of transgender under OBCs is left to National Commission for Backward Classes would again result in indefinite delays until such time as the National Commission considers the issue, and it has not happened even now. Then comes the Transgender Bill of 2015 and what kind of critique the transgender communities have offered to that and what they have suggested to the government. Following the NALSA judgment, the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment drafted Transgender Bill in 2015 and invited comments and suggestions. The minister's call was followed by numerous civil society consultations in the limited time that was provided and by submission of a number of significantly detailed comments. And that intensified the transgender activism. In fact, there are a lot of details which I have to skip, but it is worth mentioning here that the critique offered by Sampurna, an online collective of trans and intersex people, which is more comprehensive and represents all oppositions and suggestions made by community in response to the disappointing Transgender Bill of 2015. And the important critical observation of Sampurna regarding the above bill included omission of intersex person. In its critique of the draft, Sampurna highlighted the omission of intersex person and communities from the bill in 2015 bill I'm talking about, and affirmed that the bill should be renamed as the Right of Transgender and Intersex Person Bill, and that has not happened yet. The above critique reads, all intersex people face acute issue like lack of access to healthcare, education, employment, and face violence, stigma, and discrimination at multiple levels. Moreover, these people are people with intersex variation who also identify as transgender. We recommend that the bill be renamed the Right of Transgender and Intersex Person Bill. Then the 2000 bill included diagnosis and certification of transgender person by appropriate authorities for availing the benefits of transgender. Sampurna's critics strongly de-recommended the certification and diagnosis of intersex and transgender person. The apprehension expressed that process of diagnosis and certification would lead to gatekeepers and power brokers at multiple levels, both within the state mechanism and trans-intersex communities. The diagnosis also goes against the spirit of self-determination of gender reiterated within the text of Supreme Court verdict. A trans woman from city of Hyderabad reflects, it felt downright draconian and outrageous. I felt like a toy at the hands of an all-powerful juggernaut of government of India or like a lab rat being dissected against my will by it. We as transgender persons, collectivized, did many media and press conferences, sit-in protests, rallies, and met up MPs and functionaries of Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment to register our opposition to the bill. Health as a major concern. Sampurna's critique emphasized the use of non-pathologizing diagnostic framework of trans and intersex people followed the standard international practice recommended by WAFT, World Professional Association of Transgender Health. It mentioned that health is a huge concern of trans and intersex people, and hence a separate chapter on health will be brought into the bill that fully addresses the trans and intersex healthcare as well as general healthcare of these communities. The appropriate best trained medical professional like endocrinologist, gynecologist, urologist, for intersex and non-pathologizing mental health professionals should be provided to cater to specific and general health needs of the community. So all this will require investment from the state, a budgetary allocation from the state. The critic implied that these health professionals should have the sensibility and understanding as per WAFT's guidelines. So trans health should be an additional chapter in the bill as physical and mental health are serious concern for the community. Responsibilization of the state. In Sampurna's view, the draft only mentioned awareness raising about transgender communities without responsibilization of state through formulating and implementing legal protection and safeguards. So only saying that discrimination should be stopped against transgender. But what is the route map? There is no concrete guidelines. So the critic said a mere awareness raising would sound tokenistic and cosmetic without instituting concrete mechanisms for empowerment of marginal communities. Affirmative action. They also talked about, they wrote to Ghazala Meenal, the Joint Secretary, Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. We recommend that all trans and intersex people be considered socially backward and affirmative action be sought in education and employment. Special consideration in terms of benefits and affirmative action be given to trans and intersex people. As many trans and intersex people are forced to leave their respective natal homes, they fail to acquire documents which will entitle them to avail welfare schemes of the government. Given this severing of ties with a natal home, it would be difficult to produce any document to further acquire other important documents like caste certificate. The above suggestion was made by the community. It holds a special weight that documents should not be considered because they can't procure documents because they have cut off from their families and also getting a caste certificate or anything becomes very, very difficult. Inclusion, they also opposed rehabilitation, which was there in the bill. So, opposing the rehabilitation framework, which the transgender communities find pathologizing and oppressive, Sampurna rejected the model on the ground that it is borrowed from outdated disability discourse. Instead, rehabilitation should be conceived of as removal of barriers that mainstream society has placed in the way of trans and intersex communities, leading to their historical disenfranchisement. The sex workers have found rehabilitation model not only forced but draconian and disempowering, and transgender activists are aware of these instruments of institutional dehumanization and violence. M, a transgender leader and intellectual from City Hyderabad, argues that rehabilitation model is deeply entrenched in raid and rescue model of US State Department and does not acknowledge free will of sex workers who choose it as a livelihood. She further adds that under the framework of most recent Trafficking Person Prevention Care and Rehabilitation Bill 2021, this process will become more brutal, leading to further criminalization, incarceration, and forced rehabilitation. Self-identification versus third gender. Both the NALSA Judgment and 2015 bill represent a contradiction as far as self-identification of gender is concerned. While they suggest that trans person can choose male, female, third gender identity, they also propose that all transgender person be declared as third gender. In Sampurna's critique, a transgender and intersex person should have the right to self-identify their gender and free to choose between any of the gender categories man, woman, transgender, third gender, whatever they feel. Budgetary allocation, amendment of IPC, medical education, helpline sensitization, reassignment surgery, and medical education, special leave. These are all things demanded. So Sampurna also recommended budgetary allocation to implement the suggested programs of empowerment and development, amendments to Indian Penal Code and to include wide spectrum of trans and intersex identities that exist in society. It emphasized specific sensibilities within Human Rights Commission and prison system towards trans needs, and even the prison reforms has not been done even now. It argued that gender affirming procedures or sex reassignment procedure, including counseling, surgery, and hormone therapy, be made free, and the sensitization program on transgender intersex communities should be part of the syllabus. For sex reassignment surgery, appropriate leave should be granted in government and private jobs. It advocated specific sensibilities within Human Rights Commission and prison system. It put forth the hostel, helpline, emergency services be made available, and trans and intersex sensibilities should be brought within curriculum of medical education. As per transgender community leaders, some states have taken initiatives to facilitate transgender welfare, but there is hardly any concrete measure taken at the national level despite guidelines incorporated in the answer verdict. Then comes 2000. So this was the critique offered by the community. Then comes 2016 bill. Apart from many other pro-trans civil society across the country responded to 2015 bill draft suggesting changes, amendments, but the government in August 2016 passed a more regressive version of its own bill, followed by protest, mobilization, critical reflection from the transgender community. The critic mentioned that the bill is a dangerous form of tokenism As per the critic, the regressive clauses in bill completely eliminated the right of self-determination. So it was a further regressive bill, 2016. It eliminated right to self-determination of gender through a rigid and injurious definition of transgender as being part male and part female. The objection of choosing male or female identity, which was included in earlier drafts in 2015, was made an impossibility. According to the present draft, a transgender person is one 2016 draft, neither wholly male nor female, a combination of female and male, neither female nor male. Though NALSA judgment has remained far from being ideally implemented, the principle of self-identification and its broad understanding of gender has opened a space for transgender person to obtain documents that identify them by gender of their choice. With this definitional closure, the space was firmly set. Chapter 3 of the 2016 bill goes on to provide a mechanism for recognition of identity. As per the draft, a transgender person may apply for a certificate of identity to district magistrate, who will then refer to application to district screening committee, which will issue a certificate of identity to person. This issue that providing for such an onerous procedure stands in violation of fundamental principle of self-identification. The draft bill included a single chapter on discrimination in certain spaces like educational institution, healthcare service, employment, but it failed to provide definition of the discrimination itself in 2016. The bill further hollowed the discrimination clause by not mentioning any enforcement provision. Another fallacy in the bill was criminalization of beggary. This not only ignored the ground reality that begging is one of the few income generating options available to a large number of transgender persons, and criminalizing it would provide another avenue of misuse of power to police and authorities. There have been a number of instances where transgender individuals have disproportionately targeted under the general law related to beggary. The affirmative action in educational institution employment disappeared from 2016 bill. A massive bureaucratic apparatus in the form of National Council for Transgender Person was created, but has also been rendered toothless without any significant power. So these were the point of mobilization of transgender communities again 2016 bill. Then government was forced to institute a parliamentary standing committee, and the standing committee made very progressive recommendations, right? So what it recommended, they recommended that a transgender person should have the option to choose either man, woman, or transgender. So they had consultation with the community, a lot of consultation, in which Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Ketki Ranade, and many others were very active. So a transgender person should have the option to choose either man, woman, or transgender, as well as have the right to choose any of the options independent of surgery or hormones. A definition of discrimination should be included in the chapter 1. These are the suggestions from parliamentary committee. A definition of discrimination should be included in chapter 1 of the bill, which must cover a range of violations that transgender person face. But there was no definition of discrimination itself. Only saying discrimination will not help unless and until it is concretely defined. The 2016 bill does not refer to important civil rights like marriage, divorce, adoption, which are critical to transgender person lives and reality, wherein many are engaged in marriage relation without any legal recognition. This is also the recommendation of parliamentary committee. The committee said that the bill is silent on granting reservation to transgender person under category of socially, educationally backward class of citizens. There should be separate HIV sero-surveillance center since Hijra transgender face several sexual health issues operated by center and state. Now, what the government did, they rejected all the suggestions of the Parliamentary Standing Committee. The ministry rejected most of these recommendations. During the winter session of the Parliament in 2018, the Lok Sabha passed the Transgender Protection of Rights Bill. The bill was not tabled in Rajya Sabha due to pan-India protest against the bill in December 2017 by transgender, intersex, and gender non-binary communities. The government only considered two changes, two problematic things from the bill. Problematic definition of transgender person as incorporated in 2016 bill, and the removal of medical screening committee at district level because there have been vehement protests against this. The bill was passed in lower house of the parliament on 5th August 2019 and amid protests from community, civil society and many members of the Rajya Sabha from different opposition parties. It was passed by Rajya Sabha on 25th November 2019. Opposition MPs and Congress party requested the ruling BJP to send the bill to a select committee for further legislative scrutiny and to come up with more comprehensive bill and also move a motion in this regard. This was defeated by voting in upper house of the parliament and it was signed into law by President on 5th December 2019, despite signatures, campaign, and appeals to President of India by the community. And what were the problems with 2019 bills? A surgery certificate is required if trans person wants to identify either as male or female. This goes against the spirit of NALSA Judgment. The bill continues to conflate intersex person as transgender, despite the warning from World Professional Association of Transgender Health. In views of community, this constitutes a horrifying misrepresentation and invisibilization of intersex person and their concern. This is of extreme importance in aspect of health as there is a range of distinct issues that intersex person face, ranging from forced corrective operation to intersex infants to continuing health issues which the medical system is both unequipped to handle and is inaccessible to a large number of intersex persons. The Act is completely silent on affirmative action, which is mandated through NALSA verdict. The draft is silent about alternative families and households such as Hijra households and families, which has historically provided protective space to transgender person, intersex, non-binary people. The community in its critique emphasized the need to incorporate chosen family in the Act and to drop outdated rehabilitation model. The community finds provision for formation of National Council of Transgender highly problematic. As per the Act, the member of council are to be nominated by government with a massive disproportionate representation from trans community. Out of 25 members, only 5 transgender persons are proposed to be on board. The Act prescribes lesser punishment for violence and assault on transgender person as compared to cis women. The bill says no suit or prosecution or other legal proceedings shall lie against the government or any local authority or any official of the government in respect of anything which is in good faith done or intended to be done in pursuance of provisions of this Act and any rules made thereunder. As per the critique from the community, the right to contest the law is a fundamental right granted to all citizens. The bill also states that central government can by order published in official gazette make such provisions for expediting or removing any difficulties arising out of the bill, provided that no such order shall be made after the expiry of period of 2 years from the date of commencement of the Act. Sampurna writes, we know the reality of government process and how long it takes for the wheel of bureaucracy to move. By attempting to remove any possibilities of amendments after 2 years, the government wants to ensure that everything related to the bill is done within in terms of office. The community filed several petitions challenging constitutional validity. I'm coming to the end of it. I think I've taken a lot of time. The community filed several petitions challenging constitutional validity. On February 20, the 5 transgender activists filed a petition in Supreme Court pleading that the Act stands in conflict both in constitution of the Indian government, etc. And then the government was sort of forced to go for, the rules, the transgender rules, and it accepted some of the provisions, some of the demands of the community. So, but still, many of the demands of the community have not been considered, and the movement is sort of going on. In between, the pandemic has come, but and then there are two kinds: the rules also exist, and the act also exists, and there are contradiction within the rules and the act. And the significant success of transgender intersex mobilization surfacing in transgender rules is in terms of self-determination of identity to a considerable extent. It appropriately summarizes the provisions related to self-determination of gender, which is made convenient for the transgender person. So, That shows the success of mobilization, critiques, and litigations which are already pending in the Supreme Court. The government, without promising affirmative action, but still the affirmative action is not promised by providing concrete reservation under the rules, also make a provision to constitute a welfare board, provide a mechanism for ensuring non-discrimination of transgender person in public life, including setting up a transgender protection cell and drafting an equal opportunity policy. I think many things I will sort of cover in the discussion if being asked. There are certain states which have taken steps like Kerala, and many other states are taking some steps, but many states like Telangana and many other states have not at all responded to the substantive provisions within the NALSA judgment. And the national level, there is no guideline as to how to implement the substantive aspect of NALSA judgment into the practice. So, despite the definitional and epistemic problem, the Supreme Court verdict promises a substantive transformatory potential for the transgender, the most marginalized and stigmatized community. While the government is obliged to adhere to provisions in 2014 verdict in translating the legal text into an act and ensuring its implementation towards empowerment, the government has been apathetic and sometimes even anti to community interest. The transgender communities, however, have been resilient and firm in opposing the regressive aspects of governmental draft bills and final act of 2019. The persistent mobilization, not only through organized protest but equally through a fierce critique of governmental interventions, culminated in accepting some of the demands of the community through Transgender Rules 2000. It appears that neoliberal state, while willing to protect constitutional rights of the marginalized groups, so if they consider self-determination of right, that is fine. But there are other provisions like health, education, affirmative action, separate seropositive surveillance mechanism, etc. These always required budgetary provisions, etc., which the government is still washrooms in public spaces and everywhere. That becomes a challenge. The gender neutral hostels and many other provisions which requires a substantive allocation of resources. The demands such as free trans-friendly health services, SRS surgery, the sex reassignment surgery, gender neutral washrooms would certainly require investment and sustenance for those resources. In the governmental estimation, the transgender community probably may not constitute a vote bank like scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward castes, and even the economically backward within the upper caste, and they have been given reservation. And democratic decision of the political establishment rely on the numerical strength of the community. Nevertheless, the strategic and persistent collective mobilization of communities have made government consider some of their demands. The community is continuing its fights in expectation of further democratization and better future. I stop here. Thank you.
Okay. Thanks, Pushpesh, for this very substantial and detailed discussions of both, also within a short span of time, right? Like from the
Yeah,
NALSA
I had so
to
much,
now.
but I
Yeah,
thought that.
so much has
Yeah,
happened in terms of the debates and activist discussions, but also the changing faces of the drafts of the bill, right? In which
yeah,
even the fundamental category of how do you define transgender continues to undergo so many different
yeah,
shifts, right? Like so, and it is like you're saying, still a ongoing struggle, and the whole pandemic situation has also
yeah,
thrown some of these questions that you're saying about what is the responsibility of state, and
great.
around health, other provisions, material socio-economic questions, right? Like I think that's only become more sharpened in this last 1.5 years, right? Like
Yeah,
so, yeah, I think there's a lot of issues we could take up for discussion. I can come back in the end with some questions I have, but I think I'll open it up now to any questions, any clarifications you would like. I see many people here who work on issues of trans politics and sexuality politics more broadly. So anything you want to ask, and I'm sure Pushpesh will be happy to interact. Yeah, thanks. You could also type the questions in the chat box, and one of I can read it, or Pushpesh can read it. But maybe Pushpesh, while we are waiting for people to formulate their questions, one question that I wanted, to
Yeah.
ask more in terms of other work that you have done, and this particular direction this presentation is taking. One of the aspects that you brought up, especially towards the end of the discussion, is also this kind of differences in regional responses, right? Like both in
Mhm.
terms of the way different regional states have created provisions, acted on the NALSA judgment, or from Tamil Nadu to Kerala to Telangana, the differences you see there, but also drawing on your recent publications, looking specifically at modes of activism that we see, especially in newly formed states like Telangana, where transgender movements seem to have taken on a very different shape and form, also because of the way it's speaking to other modes of activism, like say Dalit politics, and raising fundamental questions around what you are saying as sort of the kind of civic provisions that the state is willing to acknowledge, or sometimes even creating new categories of governance, but that the kind of budgetary or substantial measures is a direction that the neoliberal state is unwilling to go towards, right? Like, so how do those questions get shaped? Why are these kind of central government moves, but also responses that are both at the state governmental level, but also different modes of activism? Could you talk a little more about that?
Yeah, sure, sure. I will talk about Telangana, and I've written about it. Telangana, I mean, we also have to see the historical specificities, regional context, etc., in which activism is taking, though it also has a national coalition, national face, etc. They also connect to the national, transnational politics, but they also have a regional diversity which is happening. And the government is pulling it in the direction of very Sanskritized and different kind of projecting the face of transgender movement in terms of trans feminine identities. You have Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi and others who are pulling it in that direction. But then in Telangana, there's a specific history. When the Telangana state was being formed and the struggle was going on, people mobilized hijras and trans women, and their energy was harnessed within the movement. But when the state was formed, they did not get anything. So they said that, yeah, and then Muslims started demanding their rights. Women started talking about rights within Telangana, the feminist groups, etc. Then trans people also started mobilizing, and they said, "What is there for us? What are you giving us?" And they felt cheated and disenchanted, and that led to the mobilization. That is one factor. The other factor is the leadership. This was the time when Bittu had joined our university, who is in Asoka University now. And Bittu also injected a kind of left and Dalit and other perspective into the movement. And then there was a lot of dialogue which gone on within the community, and how they started talking about the caste issues, the class issues, the issues of other kinds of political economy kind of issues. So what is exactly should be the face of trans mobilization, trans movement, etc. How we bring in caste. Then they've started forging alliances with feminists, Dalit feminist groups, Dalit groups, and then the Dalit groups started forging an alliance with trans movement. And I know the some of the Dalit students leader who started writing poetry in the praise of glorifying the hijras, in Telugu poems, etc. And that triggered a different kind, that took the trans movement in a different kind of trajectory. And then you will see when Rehut Bemula is happening in University of Hyderabad campus, the trans people are thronging in, and they are gathering in large numbers, sitting on dharnas, strikes, etc. and even the Rohit Sahadat Divas, to commemorate that, in this memorializing and commemorating or whatever. Every year you will see the trans people are coming. So then it got into a different mode, and it acquired a different kind of meaning. And I think that that also injected this element within the national level, trans politics. But there are other trajectories, definitely, but this is also a very visible trajectory within the trans movement in India. And I think it starts from Hyderabad. It does start from Hyderabad. It does start from Telangana, in fact, because also of the leadership. One is leadership, another is regional politics, in which trans women are used for the anti. I mean, whatever that the Telangana movement which was going on, and then they felt disenchanted. So these two things I sort of identify. And then there is also an active Dalit feminist politics, which is there. And these Dalit feminists have also contributed in terms of strengthening the trans movement, helping out trans people, listening to their problems, etc., identifying with them. And then they have a sisterhood, the Dalit feminist and trans women. In Hyderabad, there is a kind of sisterhood which has emerged. They talk to each other. There is an interface. They go for their mobilization. They come from their mobilization. The Dalit feminists are writing poetry and stories and other things in Telugu, for trans life, on trans life. So this is a kind of something which is very different, but it might also change, and I need to further explore it. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah, I think we have a question here from Mukul Sharma. Should I just read it out? That
yeah,
might be easier.
sure, sure, sure.
So Mukul's asking, will it be right to conclude that the trans rights movement in India is at a stage where the women's rights movement was 100 years ago? Okay. It's a broad question. Yeah, yeah. I don't know.
um,
Mm.
So I don't know where was the women's movement 100 years ago. Can Mukul sort of can you speak and
Yeah,
explain?
yeah. You could just come and speak,
What do you
Mukul.
mean by women's movement 100 years ago means to you?
Yeah.
To me, good evening, sir.
Yeah,
Uh, to
good evening.
me, women's rights movements, in terms of their voting rights, in terms of their social emancipation and coming out in the workforce, like that stage was still work in progress, and like uh, far more different from what it is today. So, like, is it where it was 100 years ago in terms of trans movement?
See, trans communities, there could be some overlap between the experiences of trans communities and women. And again, trans cannot be homogenized. There are many trans people who are also very privileged today, and for them, working in public spaces and visibility and resources, etc., may not be a problem. There are many trans students who come to our university. They are very elite, English speaking, and privileged kind of a background. So for them, the things may be different, but for many trans people, you can't compare, the women's situation. At least women are, supposed to be within the cis kind of a context, so women's bodies are required by the community, by the society, to reproduce themselves, by the families to reproduce. So women are disprivileged, subordinated, marginalized, but they also need it. But the way trans bodies and trans people are perceived in the communities, in the society, or in the mainstream society, that they're non-reproducing bodies, and you can just dispense with them. So that is the difference, and they will be discarded. Where you don't have history of women discarded in the manner as trans women or trans identities have been discarded. So there is an overlap, but there is also a difference. So comparison in that sense becomes a difficult thing for me to sort of compare women and trans. But even if you put it within the comparative frame, but I think that majority of trans, if you see trans feminine identities, hijra identities, and all that, they have no education, access to education, etc., etc., with a male, with a kind of body wrapped in cross-dressed body. So a woman's body is not a cross-dressed body. The cross-dressing itself means so much of marginality, right, within a socio-economic context. So women struggle, get educated, find some job, still violence is there in public spaces, family, domestic, etc. But still those violators also need women, but they don't need trans people. And that is a major difference between a normative world and the world beyond normative. So what mediates trans existence is also the non-normative, right? So it is comparable, but it is also not comparable in that sense, in my understanding. So it is very difficult for me to answer your question that 100 years back where women were trans people are there. It's a different kind of a history. It's a different kind of, a configuration. And it's a different kinds of normative and non-normative which mediate their existence. And it's an overlapping thing that they also face violence in public spaces, public transport. That many of the trans women would say they have less money, but they avoid traveling in public transport because of the fear of violence. As women also fear violence, in the public transport system, right? So there are overlaps, but there are also different kind of historicities in which womenhood and transhood may be embedded. So it is comparable, but it is also different.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, Thank you. I think there's a question from Supraja and then Asima. Supraja, why don't you go ahead?
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, Professor Pushpesh, for such a wonderful lecture. I also have, so based on what you just answered right now to Mukul, and also building from what Professor Navneeta had asked you before, I'm also curious about how, now that you've given us a very, very evocative, capacious overview of 2014 to the present, going back to your article where you spoke of the necropolitical and the question of how that affected Hyderabad as a space, or how that manifested in Hyderabad as a city space, I'm curious as to how you would perhaps conceptualize or theorize something of the same kind. And for those who might not know what the necropolitical is, it is where certain subjects are granted care and life at the behest of others who are meant to die. So my question is how you would perhaps conceptualize that in the current present through the pandemic. One can't call it post-pandemic, but through the pandemic, and also with the number of reports that have been, in some senses, coming out, say from Bangalore, from certain trans activists or the ALF and so on.
Yeah, definitely. It was most spectacular during the pandemic context, the necropolitical thing, whom the state cares, and how do they care, and even the media, what it captures, what it doesn't capture. So they were capturing the migrants, miseries of the migrant laborers, how they're walking, etc. And some people are coming forward to help the migrant laborers. Also, there were a lot of inquiries happening, a lot of reports were made, a lot of writings coming in the magazines, in the newspapers, in EPW, many places, and there was a lot of discussion. They were asking for many provisions to be in place. But if you consider trans men, for example, many of the trans men were suffering from gender dysphoria, and they had there was no mechanism. There are many trans people who work in the corporate and who work in the shopping malls on 10,000 salary, and they hide their identity. So all do not play out their trans identity. So most of these people lost their jobs, and many of them were HIV positive, and they did not have any mechanism to access HIV therapy or treatment. So gender dysphoria, HIV treatment, a whole lot of disconnect. The government was not even willing to understand that or engage with that. The government was not even willing that if the NGOs and voluntary sectors or crowdfunding would not have come in, many trans women would have just collapsed because the sex work was an impossibility, difficult. Many of them were moving to virtual world to do sex work. Many of them would not know. Many of them would not have smartphones, but they survived through community support and voluntary organizations, and state did not do. And they were just asking, even with the NALSA judgment, which is so substantive, and even with that vibrant community mobilization, they were just asking for 3,000 or 2,000 rupees as pension. They were filing public interest litigation. So some of the state like Karnataka started offering 1,000 pension, or maybe Tamil Nadu something. But for example, Telangana Vajanti has to file a petition in the High Court, and then High Court is saying something, and then something is implemented that even without your ration card, without your something, you will get some. So it was so much of, so you see the necropolitical framework, and within that, if you see these vulnerabilities, these marginalities, and further in the small towns in Maharashtra, I was talking to some of the Koti people, and they were saying there's nothing. So earlier they used to go out and do sex work. There's some relief. Now they all the time they have to confine to be to the family and household, and the father is drunkard, beating the mother and beating this trans child, and they were harassed at home, domestic violence of trans people. So everybody is talking about domestic violence as far as women are concerned, nationally, internationally, state level, but nobody is talking about domestic violence of these trans people, how toxic the home became for these trans people, and many of them have to go back, many of them queer people, and for the misery of trans people was manifold, and particularly in small towns and smaller places where there is no community as such. There is community, but there is no I mean, the community is not so organized as you will find in bigger cities. So there are a lot of problem, and and in Ranchi recently, few months back, some trans women committed suicide. So they are asking for sex reassignment surgery free, and it should be made instituted within the hospitals, or separate hospitals has to be provided. But Ananya from Tamil Nadu, who recently committed suicide because of, even though she paid for it, but how unsafe it turned out to be for her. So she committed, and then her partner also committed suicide. So you see, and the state doesn't care. Probably the state cares about the number. Probably the state cares about something else within the vote bank politics. The trans people may not count, and only those trans bodies count, who are within the fold of a Sanskritized kind of a model. This is what would be my response. The trans women, who were very active in politics, what happened in Telangana, there are stories who were shouting slogans against the establishment and all that. The police came into civil dress and tried to trap them somewhere, and they are put behind bars. Recently, some of the trans women they were caught for some crime or something, and they were put into men's cell. And the kind of humiliation and harassment they have suffered and they have undergone, and how they were looked at by the inmates of the prison, male inmates, and how they were under the gaze of these inmates, and what experience they had for 2-3 days, they were just narrating. And you can see the NALSA judgment said that prisons should be made trans friendly, right? But there is no prison system in India which is very, very trans friendly, or even if they understand that, you know. So, and the state doesn't care. State, yeah, it will happen slowly, slowly, gradually. So dilly dally, dilly dally. Even if they have constitutionally given these rights, even within the rules they have considered, but they will close their eyes and they will postpone it. They will buy time, bureaucratic procedures, etc., etc. So it is not that important. But state was in a hurry. The government was in a hurry to give, concessions to the underprivileged within the upper caste segment, economically backward. The Maharashtra state thought that Marathas are important constituencies and we can extend reservation to them, right? Now the court is saying something else. So whom the government thinks important and why they think important and whom they push within the necropolitical kind of a framework is also a very conscious choice, so that process is not visible to us.
Yeah. Uh, Thanks, Pushpesh. Yeah. I mean, I think the whole discussion is also in some ways making you look at these different facets of the state, no? Because on
Yeah.
the one hand, you have this, the state that is controlling, but on the other hand, there's also an appeal to the state to take
Yeah.
responsibility, and that
Yeah.
constant,
Yeah.
I think that's the fact that the state has in practice, right? Like, what does it mean to different categories and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
vulnerabilities also,
Yeah.
right?
And at what point of time
Yeah,
and
yeah, exactly.
so it becomes a process, as you said.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think Asima has a question. Asima,
Yeah.
go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, Pushpesh, and
Yeah.
yeah,
Thank
hi,
you.
Navneeta.
Hi.
Yeah, it's interesting lecture. And then listening to this tussle between NALSA judgment and transgender bill, and then transgender activism back and forth. There is a larger puzzle, I thought, it was not discussed in the sense that, yes, we understand that the whole, we start with this neoliberal kind of, debate, and then the funding and so on. But even, those scholars have been talking about the fault line within the constitution in terms of, like Rajiv Bhargava or Sibatsan, talking about how we have talked about very vocally fundamental rights, but when it comes to welfare rights, health rights, education, everything was undermined under directive principle of state policy. It's like seva in the meta narrative, the way Srivatsan talks about. So it was there from the very beginning, so-called, Nehruvian era. So now that's why, when we discuss COVID, how even small thing like vaccine, we can't even fight it. Even also migrant workers, informal laborers, still also, gainful employment and also, wage in time. It's a kind of a battle, though, Supreme Court talks about, but still is a thing. So even in this, also for me, the kind of question which you are raising, like even if NALSA judgment is substantive, but at the same time also you see a kind of revolution and counter revolution in Ambedkar's work. So therefore you have transgender bill which omits all this kind of thing. So in this way, how are the transgender activists and lawyers, how are they articulating their socioeconomic rights? Because I'm curious to know, because if I look at in the field of health, there are lawyers actually articulate in terms of right to life, Article 21, and from there they actually bring health and education and other things related. So can you reflect on those lines if there are?
Yeah.
So it will be
Yeah.
helpful.
So the government, the state is of judiciary and then police and bureaucracy and legislative, whatever. So the government, which is part of the state and very vital part of the state, is very reluctant, and even if it has considered at the end in the rules, 2020 rules, some of the demands. And some of the demands which the state has considered may not require much investment in budgetary allocation. For example, self-determination. Okay, you decide your gender, fine. Which the state was very, very reluctant in the beginning also, the government. So that will not require, but the state, if they want to make the hospitals geared towards transgender health on the line of international guidelines of trans health, it will require a lot of reworking of the existing hospitals or creating new hospitals. And that is very substantive investment. Whereas the state is just postponing, not talking about, not thinking. So what the transgender activists or their friends and allies are doing, for example, Center for Law and Governance in Center for Law and Policy Research in Bangalore, CLPR, for example, Jena Kothari and others. So what they're doing, they have forged alliances with some of the trans activists, like this Dalit trans activist Grace Pano and many others. And they have started filing cases in the high courts, for example. For example, a trans woman wants to apply for a constable position, but they also want reserve. Some of them are educated and very educated, right? So they want to go for police job or military job or anything, or a seat in medical college or engineering colleges, etc. They have started filing litigations, and very recently, so through law, through legal courts and courts proceedings, and through the activism of these civil society groups as well as trans people, community leaders, something is happening, that Karnataka government has recently extended 1% reservation in government jobs and educational institution to trans persons. And some of the state on its own, like Kerala, has turned quite progressive in recent times. And Kerala, they did not know the word transgender a few years back. There's no hijra identity in Kerala, for example, right? So parallel to hijra, there's nothing existed in Kerala, in fact, in the visible terms, right? But now lots of trans activism is happening in Kerala. As Navnita has, unfortunately, I could not have your piece in the book, but she's also talking a lot about that trans activism, etc. So we have to see how the community are now constructively taking the legal provisions of NALSA in hand and going to high courts, going to Supreme Court, and that is bearing some fruit. Like many people who just elope, many trans men and their partner, etc., they're eloping and they face threat and violence. They go to court, and court is now really helping. So the government is not helping, but the court is helping in certain way, and that is a hope for the community. So if there are many litigations around health, many litigations around pension, many litigations about livelihood, and so even within this neoliberal space, neoliberal governance, some space gets created for legal activism. Like Vajanti in Hyderabad is a face of public litigations for trans people, trans community. But Telangana government is not moving, not budging at all, right? Unlike Tamil Nadu, which is a different history, but still it is violent. Kerala has come up, and some other state, Orissa to some extent, is responding and all. But so I think the use, this has become an instrument. The NALSA verdict is an instrument, and that's why they harped on self-determination, despite the government doing this or that, defining them. They feel that you cannot define us, and that has been now considered. But still, they're saying if you claim a trans identity, forget about certificates. But if you want to claim a male or female identity, you need a surgery certificate, and that they're also opposing. So I think filing of cases, and there are 5 petitions in the Supreme Court filed by different groups of trans people against the 2019 Act, which is still pending. But why the government was willing to go for transgender rules and consider some of the demands, because the Supreme Court sent a notice to the government after 3 months of the petitions, which were filed in 2020, probably 19. So in 20 they had a rules during the lockdown period, and the trans people were again saying that many of them did not have a smartphone. It's difficult to connect, it's difficult to contact and talk to them, consult them. hear their voices and then bring it. But I think that legal processes and legal interventions on behalf of the community by some of the civil society groups and community leaders themselves is something which is creating a space within this dialectics of NALSA judgment and state reluctance, substantive justice and state reluctance. Some space is created through the legal activism and intervention of civil society as well as the community. That is the only thing happening, and then maybe when the pandemic subsides, something happens again, the activism will trigger. That is my anticipation.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Pushpesh.
Yeah.
Are there anyone with further questions or? Uh, Reshma, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Reshma. Thank you very much for the lecture. I
Yeah, we.
Can you type your questions and
We can't really hear you talking. Can you just type your question, Reshma? I can read it out. Yeah. Or you could.
probably it will take time.
Yeah, maybe we can hear you now. Why don't you
now
repeat
we can
segment?
hear
Let's see.
you.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, now we can hear. Just go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, better now?
Yeah, it's better now.
Okay. Yeah, you mentioned Kerala. So yes, Kerala is among the states that are ahead of others in terms of introducing
No.
measures.
No,
It's not helping, Resh.
We have
Can
a
you just
problem.
write? Can you just type?
Yeah.
Okay.
And Kerala, I think Navnita will be able to respond more than me.
Yeah.
But definitely something is happening there, which wasn't there at all.
No, I think you just type the question.
Hey, am I audible now?
Yeah,
No?
you are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I'll just try once again.
Okay.
So no, I was saying that Kerala is ahead of other states in terms of introducing and implementing some of these welfare measures and budget allocations and so on, like you rightly said. And it manages to say "but" in Kerala in this context also. So, but however, there are a lot of other issues. I was thinking born out of this whole sudden overwhelming interest of the state in introducing these measures without having an insight, a social political insight of the realities of queer lives or transgender lives. So I was thinking about that when for example, Ananya, you mentioned a while ago, is actually from Kerala, and
Yes, it's from Kerala.
yeah,
Sorry, yeah.
yeah, and you, I guess you mentioned uh, affirmative actions, but also prisons, right? So there is a prison reserved for trans people in Kerala, and soon after it was it was in place, the police put false cases on 14 trans women and put them, or 11 trans women, and put them in behind the bars for 14 days or something. And so I was just thinking of this whole framing and the focus on welfare schemes and policies and resource while I'm not denying that that's important, but I was thinking of of that for this whole idea of focusing on that and thinking in that direction, because on the other hand, from your lecture and otherwise, we see these alliances taking place in places like Telangana between, like you said, Dalits, feminists, and trans women, for example, and which is really encouraging. And while in Kerala there are a lot of welfare measures, etc., but then one doesn't know what to ask for now. There are lots and lots of problems still existing, a harassment from the police also, which means from the state machinery also. But then everything is in place. This contradiction is very much there in places like Kerala, which is why, at the outset, everything is good and fine, but then it is not really so. So this contradiction I was constantly thinking of throughout the lectures, and just wanted to
Yeah.
point that out. Yeah, thanks.
Sure, I fully agree with you what you're saying. And one of the thing is that even in statist imagination, if you go by different states, still, despite NALSA judgment, despite the community mobilization and protest, they just reduce the trans identity to trans feminine, either Hijra or Aravani or Tirunangai or something. And the state also considered them as the subjects, trans subjects,
Very true. Very true.
not the diversities of bodies which claim to be trans identities or genderqueer and all that, though they have mentioned in the text, but they don't consider, and they are invisible, and their problems, etc., is not so. A state will also try to amplify certain identity as trans identities and try to do something for them, and that's a very reductionist kind of understanding of trans problem, trans bodies, trans diversities, and trying to sort of easily do something and
Mhm.
not
Yeah.
enter into what I said, the substantive framework kind of a thing. And there arises these contradictions. So it
Mhm.
is
Yeah.
trying to get some kind of attention, the state, that yes, we are doing this for transgender, we are doing this for gender, but they do not have a holistic perspective. That perspective
True.
is missing within the state, and a kind of very reductionist kind of approach. And then the state has to train the entire machineries of bureaucracy, police, sensitizers, and institute something within these bodies, which requires major investment, budgetary allocation, and a bureaucratic institutionalization in place. These are the things which every state is running away from. But trans subjects also internalize. Yes, Tamil Nadu is doing this. Yes, Kerala is doing this. Yes, our Odisha is doing this. There was a meeting organized by Hamsafar Trust, and I was also part of that. And then all these people who are working for, the trans groups, which are working in tandem with the government, they all were praising the respective government. Yes, Kerala is doing this. Yes, Tamil Nadu is doing this. Yes, Manipur is doing this. But within all these discourses, you will find what is missing is a holistic perspective. What is missing is the range of trans embodiments and claims and counterclaims and whatever, and then trying to engage with this as a serious issue. So definitely you can sort of find answers within that about this contradiction which you are realizing, and I'm sure what you're saying is perfect. I fully agree with what you're saying. So the substantive thing, nobody is engaging with, no state, even those who claim to be very progressive, they are never doing that. Yeah, so the transgender rules of 2019, where you have a separate kind of differential kind of punishment. See, if a trans woman is raped, so 1 year or 2 years. But if a cis woman is raped, if the punishment it is 7 years. So what kind of imagination of bodies the state has of the trans bodies, that the experience of rape will be like okay for trans women. Okay, after all, they're men and they have become women, so they will not have the same pain which a cis woman undergoes. Maybe this kind of imagination, and there is no serious engagement in dialoguing with the community. And I think that in a vote bank kind of a politics, in a numerical strength, all those play out in the governance circle, and this is how they try to dispense with by doing some kind of tokenistic thing here and there. And then there is a competitiveness among the states to say that we are also trans progressive now to some extent, and then they will do something or something, but there is no serious engagement with the issue. And also within the neoliberal context, they don't want to do it, they don't want to institute anything. The only thing hope is the mobilization which is happening. The only hope is the court and litigations and the commitment of some trans intellectuals and communities and civil society groups, which is the only hope I see here in this constricted space.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah. I think there's another question from Sutnanuka Bhattacharya. Yeah. Go ahead,
Oh
Sutnanuka. Yeah. Yeah.
my God.
Good evening.
Sutanuka.
Yeah.
No, sir. Good evening.
Yeah.
Good
Uh,
evening. Yeah.
Good evening, sir. Actually, as you talk about, it's just a comment about the budgetary allocation from the central government, basically.
Mm-hmm.
What in West Bengal and other some states have received it
Mm-hmm.
is the Garima Griha funds.
Uh-huh.
And we also have to, I guess, see what is happening trans politics in the Hindutva kind of a
Mm-hmm.
regime, where certain the trans persons council, national trans persons council,
Mm-hmm.
where certain when we are talking about the government is caring about which trans person.
Mm-hmm.
There are when the trans council happened, the national council for transgender persons right happened, it was very few people knew about that from
Yeah.
the trans community.
Sure.
And when the fund those funds for a year long fund for Garima Griha has been sanctioned, allotted, it's very few people know about that, and very few trans community leaders actually know about that. So it is I am just wondering that in that case, so within the community, I feel that the government itself is divided, the central government itself dividing the community, saying that some people are valid, certain bodies are valid, which you are also mentioning, and certain trans bodies are not valid, or the people who lobby with the central government gets more position, more fund allocations, more facilities, benefits than the other who are in the more marginal, I guess, more marginalized section of the community. So somebody from Tamil Nadu, somebody like Grace Banu, cannot reach to the center, whereas
Yeah.
can be heard at the central government, or somebody like Vajanti, who is so active in Telangana, cannot be heard by the central government, but somebody like Lakshmi Narayan Tripathi would be heard.
Sure. Yeah.
So within the budgetary allocation also, we have this something not so friendly happening.
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah.
so it was just when we talk about, so I was just thinking about that.
Sure.
And
Mm.
of course, the entire, which you have constantly mentioning, the entire spectrum of transgender person, which includes transmasculine and non-binary persons, are missing, what
Yeah.
we see given our history of historical and cultural background of India or South Asia for that matter.
Yeah.
So that's it, sir.
Sure.
And
Sure.
thank you for your presentation.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you, Sutanuka. And I fully agree with what you are saying. The nomenclature itself, Garima Grief, it goes with the whole project of everybody knows, and I don't need to mention that name. So it goes with that whole normative, so a kind of normativizing certain kind of trans articulations and connecting it to Vedas and Sanatan and all that. So Lakshmi Narayan is a Mahamandaleshwar kind of a thing. So
Yes.
whatever budgetary location, etc., and whatever positions are being made, so this kind of constituencies will be active and will be recruited, and that is the one of the critique of the trans communities, that what kind of people have gone into that National Council for Transgender Bodies, right? If you look at, they all come from privileged
Yes.
caste background also,
Yes. Yes.
not only
Exactly.
not only class but also caste background. They
Yes.
all are brahmanical or upper caste kind of a background, and that is the whole critique coming up from. So what kind of representation of trans problems or trans communities or what they had. And then there was a lot of fight recently went on a WhatsApp group of trans people, when the Lakshmana Tripathi was saying that what is the difference? Trans is trans. There is no caste. There is no class. Everybody is trans. So on the one hand, people like her will negate the class caste within trans. On the other hand, Grace Manu will bring it to the forefront, and then who is paid attention to by the state, by the government, is an issue. And that's what Sulkanuka is saying. And I think you're quite right. And also the whole nomenclature, Garima Grih, a pride without having a pride, creating a sense of pride when there is no pride actual, which is an existential reality, so it's an elusive kind of a title, elusive kind of a nomenclature within that trans body is wrapped and try to. So Garimagri will very good go with Rashtravad also.
Yes.
So those kind of imaginations are being instilled by the state, and this is how trans bodies are essentialized and normativized in certain ways. And those kind of body becomes a privileged body within the trans, and that invisibilizes the whole range of embodiments, the problems, the kind of substantive issues which many embodiments will throw into open. Those are not engaged with by the state at all. And this is the dilemma of so-called NALSA substantive judgment and the kind of space which state is creating around that judgment. And this is in this the trans subjects are caught trapped, and the only hope I'm seeing the litigations kind of thing. Some space is being created, some kind of alliances with the larger political groups, etc.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you, Sutanika, for the question.
Yeah, no, it brings up a lot of, like a lot of the contradictions of the moment also, like where you have a government, like, which has clearly very, conservative and, rigid notions around femininity, masculinity. And it's the same moment that then you are also seeing, 377 being read down, like NALSA Judgment, right? Like, how do we then read these not necessarily as contradictions, but as also then privileging certain categories, right? Like that within the queer, within trans, there is also a certain, there's certain dynamics of formation happening there, right? Which is also very linked to the larger political climate of, what histories or what cultural categories will be remembered, what will be reenacted in what ways, right? Like while also keeping, particular norms of gender intact also, right? Like, so it's a pretty, in that way, very, gives us a field to work with, right? Like,
but what makes me also happy is that if those constituencies which are privileged trying to mount and represent everyone within the trans, there's strong resistance to that, offer to that also. And so that these are some of the things which gives a kind of hope. So it is resented, rejected, and strongly opposed by the other community members, right? So questioned, critiqued. And I think many have to learn from the trans activism. I think that's quite something very, very engaging and interesting tropes which are emerging within the trans mobilizations also.
Even in the face of so much precarity.
So much of precarity, sure.
Are there any final thoughts or questions, or okay, I think that's I think we've had a great. Okay, there's Supraja has another question. Okay, go ahead, and then Anu Kuriakos also. Yeah,
maybe you should go ahead because I've already asked a question. So.
Okay, so then Anu, you could go ahead, and then Supraja can come.
Thank you, Navneeta. This lecture was quite interesting, Pushpesh sir. Mine is not a question, it's a comment that you were discussing already. You were speaking about Kerala and the progressive policies of Kerala government and the problems involved in it, like the contradictions. I'm a scholar who worked on the transgender people in Kerala, and recently I got an opportunity to interview some transgender people regarding the SRS surgery and the policies related to that. And what I came to learn from these people is that, I mean, in Kerala, there is a policy that you will get some funding from the government if you undergo sex reassignment surgery. But the problem is that this would be reimbursed only. I mean, you cannot claim
Oh,
the amount before your SRS, even if you have medical documents. So what actually happens is these people, they are I mean, they are forced to be into sex work or begging or some other kind of odd
cool.
jobs in order to make the money. So every other policies in Kerala is also like this, and some other policies raised by trans men is that, where I mean, there are no policies for employment in terms of trans men. Most of the policies are focusing on trans women. So these are some of the problems within these policies itself. Even though Kerala is raised as some kind of progressive steps towards transgender inclusion in every space. So these are certain observations on.
Sure, sure. I fully agree. I fully agree. These kind of contradictions, and state will play out different kind of self and try to, and state controls certain media, machineries or propaganda, etc. And they try to underplay these stories and amplify what interventions they're making, even if it is superficial or something. Yeah, but it is only comparative. At least Kerala has that provision. Many states will not have that provision in place also, that it will reimburse, right? That is also not there.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
of course, that is a fine thing, a fine move.
No, what you're saying is I fully agree. I fully agree.
Yeah. Yeah, I think from what you know what Reshma was also saying, right? Like it, like, and I
Mm.
think Pushpesh, you were also mentioning this. It's an interesting thing that you were saying, right? Like that it is a state in which the category has come as a governmental category, right?
Hmm.
So historically, like unlike Tamil Nadu or Karnataka, I mean, not that people were not present, but the question of what visibility certain bodies had, and now suddenly there's a marked shift, right? Like it's
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
it's from models to actresses to all these governmental measures. So then how does that play out, right? And I think what Anu and both Reshma saying, looking at these contradictions then I guess
Hmm.
becomes important, right? Like, and especially, like, I think there's something about Kerala as a state that it is very invested in both the progress narrative, but also in these categories that it invents, right? Like whether it's the woman, whether it's the
Yeah.
like that becomes very, then at particular historical moments, that becomes very central to the state's own narratives of
Yeah.
progress, or
True.
so, and often it doesn't look at the how this actually what kind of experiential and material realities this produces, right? Like which are
Yeah.
often very contradictory. Yeah, I mean, I guess there's a lot we could talk more about, but there is Supricha, why don't you come in? Yeah.
I'm not entirely sure I should ask my question now, mainly because I'll kind of be steering the conversation to another space, which is the question of aesthetics. And again, going back to Professor Pushpesh's article on TikTok, for instance, this is again spurred by what you said about how the state keeps trying to reduce various embodiments, reduce expression of gender across, right? Any spectrum. So I've been, well, at least some work of mine back when I was in the Masters in Arts and Aesthetics in JNU, kind of tried to look at how the laws came about with, say, the Trans Act. And then you had a film such as Shubh Mangal that came out, I think, in February 2020. And right after that, you have Akshay Kumar's Lakshmi come out, right? And yeah. So yeah, this is a whole new hornet's nest that I'm opening up. But I was just curious as to how you would see this kind of state, I mean, obviously, state sponsored idealization based on a certain kind of, okay, like necropolitical, sure, but also restriction of any kind of expression beyond what the like the image of the hijra does, or the again the ghostly image of the hijra does, the speaking from the death aspect. Whereas for Shubmangal Jada Davtan, you see that they're married, and there's also this whole aesthetics of like calling on previous Hindi films that kind of solidify this hero structure that's happening. What did you, was there any thought that you had, sir, on like how you would see TikTok as that kind of space, which you did write about, but would you ever think, or is it a possibility to even think that there could be an artistic medium that, yes, will always have to deal with co-option, but could, in some senses, provide more than just subversion? You know? Yeah.
It's a difficult question for me, but I think it's Submangal Savdhan to Lakshmi, there is a continuum, how Submangal Savdhan is kind of talking about a homonormative and homo-nationalistic kind of aspiration, which Lisa Duggan is talking about in the American context. Because once you reach to certain and then you find a continuity with now the kind of marriage rights, demand for marriage rights is coming from which kind of platform, and what this Katju and what is her name, Menika Guruswamy and Katju. You look at their I'm writing about it, in fact, and look at their Oxford address after the reading down of 377, and she's claiming she's Indian, and she's saying that we are the marriage society, right? We are the marriage society. So marriage, conjugality, is coming from, emanating from which class of queer? And then Submangal Savdhan is within Hindu, so it goes with the project of upper caste Hindu, that kind of an articulation, and fits into that. And so when somebody wrote a critical queer commentary was on the film, it was vehemently opposed by the right wing gay people, and there was attack. And then also you see when the Bombay Queer Pride and what kind of contradictions emerged within that space. So one would go for Submangal Savdhan, the other will always critique it, and then there goes the contradiction. So there is a homo-normative, homo-nationalistic tendencies, and trying to be which Ghaziani talks about a post-gay kind of, where you get mainstreamed and accepted within the mainstream middle class society through consumption and through being a conjugal partner, stability, adopt children, that kind of a tendency. So this kind of tendency is coming from very privileged queer constituency, and Submangal Savdhan is within this queer nationalistic, homo-nationalistic kind of an aspiration, whereas Lakshmi is sort of the way a very stereotypical, and also it doesn't disturb much the nationalistic aspiration of of a hijra body or of a Sanatani hijra body, whereas the hijra is auspicious but is also feared, so that kind of an embodiment, so in one context some aspect of that embodiment will be amplified, in another context maybe some other aspect of the self will be amplified. So there are two sides of the same coin, when you amplify their proximity to God or something or whatever, and their embodiment, but even then within that sphere they're feared, right? So Lakshmi embodies a kind of fear. So hijra is completely othered. There's no connect between the Submangal Savdhan guys, the corporate bodies, elite, middle class, and upper caste, and the hijra. There is a complete contradiction. So this hijra body can never be assimilated or accepted or made into the mainstream. It will be feared. a kind of fear, a kind of phobia, right? And this body can be so Mangal Sabdan kind of is accepted, blessed by the family, accepted within the mainstream, etc. And that's how you, if you look at, if you Google it and if you see the pictures of gay marriages, how they're blessed by families, NRI families, many guests are invited, priest has come to officiate the rituals and all. So I think it is going into different trajectories, and as it has gone on in the West also. So I think those kind of those we have to map it out onto those kind of debates. So there is a critical queer constituency, but there is also a very homonationalistic and homonormative kind of trend trope within the queer movement in India. I think there's a Facebook group, Hindutva queer kind of a thing.
Okay. Okay.
And in the Kashmir context, also, you see some of these NRI queer who are from India, they were saying the 377 has to be scrapped or something. Otherwise, that 370, right? So that the 377 will also apply to Kashmir. And there was a strong protest in London and all that coming from certain groups. So you see the connects among all these.
Yeah. I think that's, we've almost reached 6 o'clock, and I'm sure Pushpesh is tired now because we've been asking him so many questions. But thanks a lot, everyone. And thank you, Pushpesh, again for, such a wonderful discussion, so many directions, and, from activism to cinema to, to the legal deliberation. So it's really like, it's really gives us so much to think with. And I'm sure many of these people will continue to be in touch with you with questions and such.
And I'm just promoting my book. Please have a look at my book.
Yeah.
Please come. Yeah.
Yeah, congrats again. Yeah, please
Thank
do
you.
get it. It's just recently out by Routledge, right?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you all. Yeah.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. Yeah, thanks for
Yeah.
being here.
Yeah.
All you-
Bye. Bye, Navnita. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye. Yeah. Thanks. Thanks a lot.
Thank you for letting
Yeah,
me.
yeah. Good to see you. Yeah. Bye. Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah. Bye.